Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, for joining us today to the third ServCollab Ideation workshop on designing for healthy service ecosystems. We have two speakers today, Josina Vink, who's coming from Norway, and Linda Alkire from US. And we'll have also Ray Fisk, who will moderate the discussion. Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Radula. This is, of course, one of many ServCollab webinars we've done, and I'm quite excited to be able to introduce each of our speakers for this one. This is a very exciting topic. Let me switch to my share screen, and I'll go over quickly a few slides, and then I'll introduce Josina Vink first, followed by her comments, and then I will introduce Linda Alkire, followed by her comments. But now for the screen share. So you should now be seeing on your screen let me switch my side so I can get the recording correctly. You should now be seeing the slide saying Designing for Healthy Service Ecosystems. That's the title of our session today. And the two papers that they will be presenting are overlapping in topics, which is why this title, Designing for Healthy Service Ecosystems, is not in either paper quite, but the ideas overlap, and you'll learn more from them as we go. And this is our third ServCollab Ideation workshop. And again, I'll be introducing Josina Vink first, followed by Linda Alkire. But let me show you, let me remind you of ServCollab's purpose and process. ServCollab is a contraction of serving humanity through collaboration. And serving humanity is our purpose. That's why serve is in that name. And that's obviously not a simple purpose. It's not an easy goal at all. And then through collaboration is the process we pursue to achieve that purpose. So that's what the reason for collaboration being there, the process. And of course, collaboration is not an easy thing either. So the purpose is not easy to do. The process is not easy to do. And it's based on transformative service research. You can see our website, as I think most everyone already knows. That's our website for more on what we do. But this slide reminds you of what was published 2 years ago by the advisory board and myself. The seven of us wrote the article titled Elevating the Human Experience, HX Through Service Research Collaborations, Introducing ServCollab. You'll see amongst the authors that Linda Alkire, who's speaking today, is one of those advisory board members. Laurie Anderson, David Bowen, Thorsten Gruber, Amy Ostrom, and Leah Patricia are the others. And I need to emphasize that Laurie Anderson and Amy Ostrom were the key instigators of the transformative service research movement. And they organized 12 of us that got together in Baylor. I was lucky enough to be invited by these two to be part of that. And so very, very heavily, the ideas in what we've created with ServCollab are based on transformative service research. And now let me come back to that elevating the human experience idea, because when we wrote that paper, we were convinced that we could really advance the field of service research by trying to elevate our thinking. And that meant elevating the human experience, because we've talked a lot in service research about customer experience. We thought we could go higher than that, go higher. So today I've got an even higher level to share with you that we're working on inside ServCollab, because we created a mission statement in this article. Here's a new revised mission statement for you. Our revised mission statement is to serve humanity through service research collaborations that catalyze reducing suffering, improving well-being, and the new part is in green, and enabling well-becoming. Now, our previous conceptualization, reducing suffering and improving well-being, is where we were. And just recently, we stumbled across the idea of enabling well-becoming and began discussing this idea. But here, let me try to frame this for you in terms of these three possibilities. Suffering is really sort of the trailing edge of human progress, or the human challenges are all tied to suffering. Improving well-being is really what we had pitched in the original transformative service research as this core of what we're doing. It's more of an existence stage of being. But the well-becoming idea, the literature currently on well-becoming is primarily coming out of education. And well-becoming is basically looking at the human potential. What's potential in the human opportunities? So it's opportunity-oriented, it's potential-oriented. And to us, it fits very nicely with the elevated experience idea, which is why we've decided that we need to add it. So from suffering to improving well-being to enabling well-becoming. And that gets me to my last slide before I introduce Josina. ServCollab encourages research collaborations, as we've obviously emphasized in the name. And we hope today's webinar encourages you to get involved in serving humanity collaborations. And collaboration requires respecting each person's human agency and building trust among participants. Agency and trust are two of the key aspects of collaboration done right. And one last reminder about collaboration in this last bullet: collaboration is hard to do right. So we ask you to bring your eagerness and not your egos to working on projects with ServCollab. And now let me turn off these slides and come back to the issue of introducing Josina for you. So Josina Vink is an associate professor in service design at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. Josina is also the design lead for the Center for Connected Care. It's a Norwegian long-term research collaboration with municipalities, hospitals, and companies. Josina Vink's dissertation was completed in 2019, which is where I got to meet Josina for the first time. Josina quickly has become a very productive and very successful service design scholar. And I should also emphasize that Josina, prior to getting into the PhD world of publishing, had worked for the Mayo Clinic for Innovation in the United States and the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Canada, both of those in actually the implementation of service designs. So she comes to us with a very early career focus and a very successful early career focus on service design. So Josina, with that, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Ray. It's a pleasure to be with you all here on this very gloomy Oslo afternoon. I'm going to share a glimpse or highlights from the paper Service Ecosystem Design, Propositions, Process Model, and Future Research Agenda, which kind of plays into this question of how we're designing healthy service ecosystems today. And this is a paper that I co-authored with Kaisa Koskela-Hutteri, Bård Trundvold, Bo Edvardsen, and Katarina Wetter-Edmund. So as Ray mentioned, just to kind of set the scene, I did have a practice of service design for about a decade before moving into academia. And I'll just share a glimpse with you of the kind of real story from my own practice that inspired a lot of the need to do the research that I'm doing. And it sets also the kind of illustrative vignette that's at the beginning of the paper. It's the inspiration for that. So about 11 years ago, I was working at the Mayo Clinic as a service designer within a 50-person Center for Innovation team. And the first assignment that I got was to work with patients with burning mouth syndrome. So these are mostly middle-aged women who feel like their mouths are on fire. And they would go to their primary care doctors all throughout the US and mostly be met with the, I think it's all in your head. And they kept kind of Googling, and then they would come to the Mayo Clinic's website and say like, actually, I think there's this burning mouth syndrome. It kind of relates to what I have. So they would fly in from all different corners of the US to Rochester, Minnesota. And we did some observations of their journey in the clinic and did some interviews with them while they were there. And what we found was that it was kind of anticlimactic. They would fly in from everywhere, and then they would have about a 45-minute appointment with a dermatologist. They would get their diagnosis, and there's really not much more that could be done except maybe a referral to a pain management specialist. But in interviewing these patients, what we noticed is that some patients had tips and tricks for dealing with their condition that could benefit other patients. So together with the dermatology team, we decided to create a group medical visit for patients with burning mouth syndrome. And we spent, a couple of months designing every touch point in detail. We had beautiful brochures that went out to the patients beforehand to let them know how the group medical visit would be. And we designed kind of every element of this 2-day-long group medical visit that was facilitated by a pain management specialist. And then we had 2 prototypes of this, and 6 patients came for each prototype, and all of the patients that participated said that they preferred the group medical visit over an individual one. So we were really happy with the results. The other thing that was a bit more surprising was that some patients even said that their pain was reduced by meeting other people with the same conditions. So the results were really exciting and overwhelming. And after we did the prototypes, we got together with the dermatology team, and we were starting to think about how we might implement this over the long term. Everyone very excited, we were talking about it. And about 5 minutes before this meeting was done, the lead dermatologist says, yeah, but I feel more disconnected from my patients this way. And then the administrative staff person said, yeah, and actually we still haven't figured out the billing code for these group medical visits. And it doesn't really fit in the regular appointment flow in the scheduling in the calendar. So what happened was everyone agreed, yes, this would be implemented. It's such a great thing. But what actually happened was that there were only 2 other kind of pilots done of the same, and it kind of fizzled out over time. This is disappointing as a service designer, but it all brings about a key issue that I think exists in service design. The issues with the kind of lack of long-term implementation in service design, I think, reveal a really reductionist view of service design, a really narrow focus in service design that ignores kind of some of these systemic interdependencies or these institutionalized social structures that are actually influencing our design efforts within service ecosystems. So this was an impetus for kind of going into research and trying to figure out how can we make sense of this and get a better understanding so that we can influence these larger systems that we're in. What happened when I went into the literature with my colleagues was that we started to see that there has been a shift in how we understand service design over time. So starting with the work of Lynn Shostak around service blueprints and other things in the early 1980s, we really had this idea of kind of the design of services, focusing on touch points and interfaces done by managers and designers. But in the last decade, there's been a few other scholars like Daniela Santiorgi and Lucy Kimball, who have brought about a different understanding of service design that's more about creating the conditions for value and use and recognizing that we can't fully control service. And what we are trying to do then is extend this kind of continually broadening understanding of service design to make it more systemic so it better accounts for these interdependencies. So in the article, we start to flesh out kind of how the building blocks of service design are expanding over time with these different conceptualizations. So we have the design of services that I mentioned, which really focuses on this purpose of developing new service offerings. And the material is really these touch points and interfaces, the kind of physical elements. The process here is seen as a phase in new service development. So early, and then other people are kind of taking it and doing the implementation work. The actors are more these kind of expert-driven managers and designers. But in design for service, it shifts to saying not just creating the offerings, but actually creating these conditions for value and use. It's opening up more to the social material configurations and suggesting that the process continues, including in use, that designing continues. And here the actors kind of expand to include staff and service users through kind of co-design and participatory approaches. But in our service ecosystem design conceptualization, which we inform through the service ecosystem perspective of service dominant logic, we extend that even further to say, it's all about facilitating the emergence of desired forms of value co-creation. That we can't control that, but we need to work toward emergence outcomes. And the material here, we start to understand it as these institutionalized social structures or institutionalized arrangements and their kind of physical enactments that are carriers. The process we see in this, which I'll dig into a bit more, is an embedded feedback loop. So instead of design being something that's like thinking outside of the box, we see it as this feedback loop of reflexivity and reformation. And I'll dig into that in a second. And then in terms of actor involvement, we extend it from thinking just about co-design and inviting people into kind of our design sessions, but seeing that design is actually a fundamental aspect of social life. And when people are intentionally shaping social structures, they're designing. So it becomes a collective process by all actors. Just to give you a bit of the theoretical background of this paper, it really uses service dominant logic as a kind of transcendent frame to integrate theory from systems theory, institutional theory, and design theory to build this understanding of service ecosystem design and help extend this understanding of service design that we have. This image is not from this particular paper, but one that Kaisa Koskela-Huteri and I did in follow-up to this. But the paper kind of conceptualizes the key materials of service ecosystem design being these social structures. And a way to think about that is through this kind of metaphor that's often used of the iceberg. And here we can see that actually there are some elements of social structures, the physical enactments, that are visible to us, symbols, artifacts, activities, and relations, but that they have actually really deep threads that are invisible aspects to them that we need to kind of recognize when we're designing, and that these threads have kind of three different pillars coming from institutional theory. There's regulative aspects of rules and laws, things that we must follow. There's the normative aspects that we ought to follow in our roles and the norms of particular situations. And then even some of the most taken for granted are these cultural cognitive elements of these beliefs and frames. So if we think about this, for example, in a doctor's office, we might have the symbol of a stethoscope or the artifact of a lab coat, and you might have a certificate of an MD on the doctor's wall. And if we unpack those things, we can see that they're actually connected to, for example, the certificate to a regulative component that only MDs can practice medicine, or the artifact of the lab coat, this kind of professionalism of the doctor and the doctor knowing best. So we can use the physical elements to really help us understand these invisible components. And the kind of key processes of service ecosystem design is this kind of embedded feedback loop. It suggests that actually most of the time we are in reproduction mode. We're constantly just reproducing the same old social structures. So maybe even on here, there's one person talking, everyone else is listening. This is an easy thing that we can just reproduce, and that's kind of what's socially acceptable. And when we do this, it kind of reinforces for other people to do the same. But design is kind of an embedded loop within that of this process of reflexivity and reformation. And reflexivity is basically this idea of making the invisible social structures, the norms and rules and roles, visible. Once we have them visible, then we can actually work to reshape them and intentionally transform these structures. And this is all happening within this embedded loop. So it's quite tricky. So to give you a kind of empirical example of this from Experiolab's work, Ray mentioned that I did my PhD, and this is based in Sweden. So Experiolab, one of their first project was a project called the Patient Journey Project. And here they had about 24 staff from throughout one of the hospitals come together every Friday to role play different patient experiences for about eight or 10 weeks. And in the morning, they would role play it. In the afternoon, they would look back on the videos and map the patient journey. And what happened here was that by role playing, when I talked to one of the nurses, she said that it was actually by being strapped down on the stretcher and having the tubes in her nose and seeing the lights pass by overhead, that she realized they weren't really doing the patient-centered care or person-centered care that they talked about. That actually there were things happening that were way beyond her knowledge, out of her control, and it was only by this process that it catalyzed her reflexivity, her awareness of these things that were happening in everyday life. And once that happened, then she was able to go back into her unit and start making changes. She started asking patients if they knew where the washrooms were or if they wanted coffee or tea before they met. And so this sounds like a great story of design and this ability to kind of realize these underlying social structures and transform them. But actually what happened for this nurse is that when she went back into her regular unit, the other staff and her manager started saying, that's actually not how we do things around here. We can't just be asking them if they want coffee or tea. We need to kind of keep things flowing. So it's an embedded feedback loop. Design is always working in relation to reproduction. And it's important to recognize that any kind of focal design process is also relating to other design and non-design processes. So any design work that we're doing might be conflicting with design work that someone else is doing or ongoing reproduction work that it's doing. And it's only through the relation between our design processes, our non-design processes, and those of others that the emergent effects come to fruition in our service ecosystems. So really these outcomes aren't fully controllable. So that's why it's about working toward the emergence of the desired value co-creation forms that we're hoping for. So just to set this in context of another project that ExperioLab did, this is a project called First Linea, or First Line in English, and it was about early intervention of youth with mental health issues and how to get them to connect sooner to care. And here you can see an app called How Are You Now in the English translation. And everyone kind of points to this and says, this is kind of what service design can do. It can create an app. But actually, it's all these invisible elements that are taken for granted that enable earlier intervention of youth. So in the service design process of this kind of 2-year process that ExperioLab facilitated, counselors for youth started to think differently about youth. They started to see them as more resourceful and less in crisis, and that they could ask them different kinds of questions. And youth started to destigmatize what talking about mental health. And it was through these sorts of changes along the way that it was enabled these kinds of changes. But this process is not kind of alone in that. Here we can see examples of conflict and alignment of this project. On one side, you can see Olga and Louisa, 2 service designers at ExperioLab, receiving an award from a national agency in Sweden that was trying to promote citizen engagement. So very much aligned with this work they were doing to engage youth in co-design. On the other side, if you understand Swedish, you can see that there's an article in a local newspaper written by a family physician that says, "Down with the clowns," and is calling ExperioLab a bunch of clowns, and that they should leave the medical practice to the trained professionals. A different kind of conflict in what's being reproduced in the medical practice. So I won't get into this too much, but the article brings forward different implications for service design. It's kind of bringing forward these taken for granted aspects that we often don't talk about. It explains how this intentional change emerges, sometimes in the ways we don't expect. And it also expands the scope of service design, not just in a kind of context of a project, but actually taking place in everyday life. And then it also sets forward a kind of research agenda that extends to invite scholars to extend the systemic conceptualization of service design, to work at more holistic investigations into service design, and also build new and alternative methods for this more embedded collective approach beyond just kind of the designer designing. So with that, I will just end with a very small story that when I was growing up, I grew up in Canada, and my mom was a really avid gardener, and she put us kids to work, and she would assign us rows to weed in the garden, and she would take some rows. And I was a very smart child, of course, so I was very quick, and I snapped all the tops off of the dandelions and was done my row very quickly. But you can probably guess what happened. My rows grew back very weedy. And so it was my mom who kind of taught me to actually go down below the surface and kind of pull the dandelions out by the roots. And I think if we're really trying to design for healthy service ecosystems, we need to kind of go below the surface, not just be thinking about kind of the touch points and interfaces, but really working with the structures that are driving health and inequality in our systems. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josina. I like your pulling dandelions out of the service systems idea at the end there. That seems like an interesting metaphor for healthy service systems. So now it's time to introduce Linda Alkire. So Linda Alkire is also an associate professor, but in this case of marketing at Texas State University. She's also the Brandon D. Roberts Excellence Endowed Professor at Texas State. Her research is on transformative service research and is very interested in transdisciplinary contributions, research contributing to well-being. I should also note that she, as I already touched on, is already also part of the ServCollab Advisory Board. She's also part of the Board of Directors. And much like Josina, has very quickly, since getting her PhD in 2016, become a very successful service researcher. So I think that's probably enough. A lot of people already know who Linda is, just like they already know who Josina is. So Linda, it is your turn.
Thank you very much, Ray. And thank you, ServCollab, for inviting me to take part. And I'm just delighted to follow up on Josina's talk, which I really enjoyed. Thank you, Josina, for sharing your research. It's very insightful, and there's a lot of for us to learn from the service design perspective. So when Ray paired us for this project, I think he was a perfect matchmaker, because I definitely see a nice succession of my talk for, I hope everyone else will see it beyond me as well. So the topic of my talk is service ecosystem health. And I would like to tell you a little bit more about the story behind this project. So we started this project in August 2020. Around the same time, this picture of downtown Austin was shot. Those of you who have been to Austin know that this is the busiest street. It is Congress Avenue, leading to the state capital of Texas. And none of us living here would have ever thought to see Congress Street empty the way it is here. So this picture is not unique to Austin City. It probably resembles millions of other cities, pictures of other cities and towns who went through the COVID pandemic. For me personally, it was a time where I just had my first baby in May 2020. And needless to say, that led me to reflect on life and what is it that we're doing wrong, that despite all our technologies and all our innovation, life stopped, like it actually stopped in this picture. This is when I got the email from Ray inviting me to work with him on submitting a paper to the Service Science special issue, Reimagining the Science of Service. He was obsessed, and I hope you will excuse me for using the word obsessed, but this is the word that he used. So I'm just using what he said, with the idea of syndemics. And we've been exchanging a lot of emails on the topic of syndemics and the syndemics theory. And what can we as social scientists do to address a complex issue like this one? We felt hopeless. We felt, probably like many of the attendees and participants, we felt very hopeless that what can we do so that this doesn't happen again? So something like that doesn't stop life on Earth how we know it. And for those of you who are interested to read more about this paper, this is the reference. So today in my talk, I will be only highlighting few things. The paper contains a lot of kind of interdisciplinary literature, which I would love to talk to you about, but I will just highlight a few of the key points. So the COVID-19 death toll may not be as severe as the 1918 flu pandemic, but what was really unique about the COVID-19 crisis is that it did happen at the most massive scale and complexity of human history. Not only it disrupted all the global economy, but it did test the resilience of our economies and national health systems. And we are still seeing the consequences of this pandemic on so many levels and so many service systems up till today. And I don't know if we will ever fully recover from the consequences of this pandemic. So it did show us that human civilization, despite all our advances and innovation, we are really not resilient enough to prevent something like that from happening again. And it really also showed us how important ancient and modern service systems are, right? So when we say ancient service systems, we're referring to systems like family, education, government. Modern service systems are more like air travel, telecommunication services, sharing economy, the gig economy, all of these services. And interestingly, is that those are the services that accelerated the crises, right? The services that required that face-to-face interaction, which basically led to the pandemic spreading so widely, but also it fast-tracked the response through the communication that we were having. We were able to still do our work. We were able to do our shopping. We were able to reimagine and reinvent ourselves thanks to these services that were able to kind of provide us with these opportunities. But what we were interested in is this wake-up call of how can service and service scientists work to improve human service systems in crises? And this was the question. I hope the story led to this question of how this question came about. So what we did what we usually do. We went into our comfort zone, right? What we are comfortable with, what we know. And fortunately, our service field has evolved tremendously since its inceptions in the early 80s. And obviously the service ecosystem research, which Josina very much touched upon earlier, provided a much bigger kind of a understanding that the world is more complex, is dynamic, and there is a multi-actor nature for value co-creation. And obviously this comes from the service dominant logic perspective, and arguably it's probably one of the biggest theoretical contribution that our service field has seen in the recent history. However, even Bob Lush and Steve Vargo says themselves that the primary focus are on mutually beneficial service interaction. There is still a lack of understanding of forced or involuntarily exchanges, just like the consequences caused by the pandemic. So that's an opportunity for us to look into. The second area that really evolved in the last year and 12 years, and that definitely provided a completely different reimagining, if you want, of the service field, is the transformative service research area. And I don't think I need to introduce it to this crowd, but what I want to highlight here is that we realize that there is great potential to do more meso and macro level research at the TSR level. So most of the TSR work, and we argue that in an article with Josina that we wrote a couple of years ago, that most of the TSR work is still looking at the micro level, and there is a need to kind of broaden our perspective to go beyond the micro interactions, encounters, to more of a meso and macro level. So this was within our comfort zone, and we figured we're not able to answer these questions. So let's see what some other fields are doing. And honestly, this is what led us to the creation of the service ecosystem health metaphor, by looking outside the box, outside our comfort zone, to look into interdisciplinary fields and see what is it that they're doing so we can learn from them. Because obviously realizing that we're doing micro research as opposed to meso and macro research is one thing, but figuring out how to take it to the next level is for us by learning, getting new thoughts, new direction, new fields, and figure out what can we learn. So the 5 key areas that we try to kind of put them in 5 key areas are public health, syndemic theory, human ecology, ecosystem health, and planetary health. As far as we know, these are new concepts that we introduced in that article. So I will go a little bit quickly through them to give you an idea of what they are about. Again, more details, references are in the published article. So first, public health. And public health is defined as the science and art of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health through organized effort and informed choices of society, organization, public, private, communities, and individuals. So it basically says exactly what we are lacking in service research. And our thinking was that because of the fundamental complexity of human interactions, all human service systems have public health implications. For example, let's link it to service. So when women in developing countries, for example, receive more access to educational services, research shows that it improves their health, lengthen their life expectancy, and reduce infant mortality. Similarly, this example shows how education services are affected by, but also affect healthcare services. Again, 2 areas that are really hot topics within the service field. So our takeaway was that service researchers should explore public health as a lens for understanding and improving human service ecosystems at the various levels. The second theory that we looked at was syndemic theory, and this was actually the precursor for this whole project. This was where we started from, and this is where it ended up in the paper. So let me tell you a little bit more about it. So the syndemic theory originated from the public health field. It was actually Merrill Singer who developed this syndemic theory during the HIV crisis in the 80s, when he realized that the co-infections of multiple diseases is what was causing the severe interaction for HIV patients. Now, fast forward 30, 40 years, and now we talk about syndemics in a context beyond just the actual diseases, the physical diseases such as HIV. So we talk about global syndemics, or what we refer to as synergy of epidemics. And here I give an example of, for example, how obesity, malnutrition, climate change, these are epidemics by themselves together, synergy of epidemics, it's a global syndemic. And how they happen at sometimes simultaneously in the same place and time or in different places, but definitely have massive interactions between them. So by focusing on complex interactions, such as the one proposed with the syndemics theory, we can see a lot of compatibility between what service science can do and TSR can do. Because service interactions are at the core of human needs, as we know, applying the syndemic theory to solving the problems of human suffering can hopefully help prevent future pandemic and syndemics. Moving forward, human ecology, and this is probably the one that is the most we are most familiar with as Service Scholar, because the whole concept of service ecosystem was derived from the human ecology literature and the human ecology theory, which is which offer a broader perspective about the connection between natural ecosystem and human ecosystem. And again, I do cite a couple of articles here, and there's way more, and obviously the work of Josina also fall within the service ecosystem, which derives from human ecology. Later on, we looked into ecosystem health, which recently you might have heard about this whole direction about One Health, which brings in addition to the human health, the non-human health into the discussion, right? So we see the animal health, the environmental health, and how all of it together should be calling for this one health. So you can't take care of the human health if you're disregarding the other two, and same thing applies. And it provides also a powerful language for describing the environmental concerns in a holistic model for the impact of the non-human and the human ecosystem. And finally, which is probably one of the latest development in the area, at least for as far as we know, which is the planetary health. And I love this image because it was from an article in Forbes published in 2021. And it basically says exactly what the prior literature was building on, right? Most of the times we look at the individual health, who's at the center. We started talking about public health, which is more like at the community level. Global health, the various communities, how the various communities in the US and communities in Africa and communities in Asia, we all have an impact on each other. And later on, we added the animal kingdom to the One Health approach, and then the planetary health, which also offers the perspective of the climate and the planet as a whole. And I highly encourage, for those of you interested, the Planetary Health Alliance talks a lot about these issues. And I really like this quote, which basically says, if you think about it from a service perspective, it's exactly what service ecosystems is about. Everything is connected. What we do to the world comes back to affect us, and not always in ways that we would expect. So understanding and acting upon these challenges call for massive collaboration across disciplinary and national boundary to safeguard our health. And it's really basically what we talk about within ecosystems. So we just love this approach to how can we bridge between what we know about health to what we know about service ecosystem. So long story short, after synthesizing these 5 research literature that we summarized, we saw that they significantly overlap. On top of that, they overlap a lot with what we know from service research. So each literature is built from a different perspective in different fields, but basically it says the same message. And this was the precursor for us to introduce the service ecosystem health metaphor, which we define as the interdependent state of private, public, and planetary well-being necessary for sustaining life. And just like the other literatures called for collaboration across different fields, different perspectives, we are calling for the usage for that collaboration and setting common terms, common objective, common vision, which is usually the main kind of a sticky point, right? Because we use different terminology, but we are talking about the same thing. And kind of try to unite that across policymakers, doctors, educators, fashion designers, storytellers, service designers, technologists, artists, what have you, so that we can reach this service ecosystem health. And I'd like to also a little bit touch on at the end of the article, we talk about proposing a Goldilocks civilization thought experiment. And it was an experiment for us to include that content, but we were very happy that the reviewers were on board and really kind of got excited about this new idea. And let me try to explain it by explaining each term by itself so that it makes more sense. So first of all, what is the Goldilocks zone? The Goldilocks zone is the zone around a star that provides the just right conditions for life to prosper. So if you look at the picture here, you can see Earth located in the Goldilocks zone, whereas it's not too far and not too close to the sun, so that we have the ideal conditions for human life to prosper. We use the term civilization because we, using the English translation, it described the most advanced stages of human progress. And thought experiments have been used a lot in other fields, not much in service. For example, they've been used in philosophy, physics, economics. And here, I really wanted to highlight this specific thought experiment, the Veil of Ignorance, by John Rawls, where he basically, which is very much in line with what ServCollab is all about, what CSR is all about. And the idea behind it is that when you ask citizens to make choices and you put them behind this veil of ignorance, whereas we are not aware of the gender, race, abilities, tastes, wealth, position in the society, we are able to make more fair choices and fair policies without these preconceived notions that come with these categories that I mentioned earlier. So in this paper, we end by saying that we would like to convert the Goldilocks civilization from imagining it to make it happen. And how can we make it happen? Service design is obviously one of the key areas that needs to be applied. I'm not going to go in depth in there because I think Josina did a wonderful job explaining what it is and why it can be the most appropriate tool to use to address these global challenges. But the one that I want to talk a little bit more about is collaboration. Of course, collaboration is at the core of what ServCollab does. But here we'd like to highlight two things. First of all, the shared intentionality in the collaboration process, which, as we know, scientific collaboration can be described as an accelerated shared intentionality. And the reason why we're here is because of this shared intentionality that has been used to fuel our knowledge, our desire to do good things, and overall to collaborate. And second, which is the transformative collaboration, right? We talk a lot about collaboration, but the purpose of it should be transformative. It should be at the well-being level of the purpose of it should focus on the well-being. And we also talk about a few things we can do, collaboration at the micro, meso, macro, kind of reflecting the private, public, planetary well-being that we talked about earlier. So the micro, of course, the individual, small group, the paper that Ray mentioned at the beginning, Human Experience, talks a lot about that micro level perspective on well-being and the idea of meaningful inclusion. Also in prior work, we introduced the idea of service inclusion. Fingers crossed, hopefully we will have a few more additions to our service thinking there. In addition to service inclusion, we're talking about service respect, we're talking about service honesty. So stay tuned. There's a follow-up coming for this paper, which we're very, very, very excited about. At the meso level, we in prior work, again, we talked about the role of firms, organizations, cities in increasing what we call symbiotic value, that it's everyone's job. It's not an individual person who can make the change at the meso level. And the planetary, which we really think there's a lot of potential to be done there, a lot of potential areas to be done there, which focuses on planetary collaboration between nation states, especially to address topics that are like the pandemic or climate change. And I would like to end this talk with this specific picture, because for me, it really, it's a picture of planet Earth from the space. And the reason why I like it is because you can't see countries, you can't see boundaries. It just shows you that we all live on one planet. And we need to preserve this planet for the good of all of us. Thank you for your attention. I'm eager for the Q&A session.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda. And thank you, Josina. So now we've had the two presentations, and obviously they do connect. They're both connected to service ecosystems, both with a long-term focus on how can we improve things? How can we really make things better? Let me let the audience that are invisible to me, but hopefully are not invisible in terms of being able to ask questions on the screen or by chat, let them ask questions of Josina and Linda. So if we can make that happen. Is it possible to see everyone else? I'll try to, on my side, see if I can see everyone else. I'm still only seeing the original group. So officially there are other people in the system. Can our IT person help us with that? So Zena, your microphone's off if you were trying to say something.
No, I do think they can all add on to the chat if I think that's
okay.
possible.
Well, then we may need to do that. But since I'm not seeing a question across my screen for chat, let me bring up a question that has been on my mind with ServCollab, and it very much relates to why I was so excited about service design as something we needed to be talking about for ServCollab, and that is the issue of, all right, so design is an important tool. I think it's one of the most exciting things I've been able to help participate in this century, because I was doing satisfaction research in the last century. And boy, that's just too small. It's just, you're thinking too small if you're only looking at satisfaction. There are bigger issues and bigger challenges, which is why, to me, service design is a far better lens to look at how to address with problems. So the question for both of you, and to let each of you respond, is the question of, where would you start if we could only start one place? And of course, systems are so complex. What I'm asking is a hard thing, because everything's connected to everything. But where would you start? If you can't do everything, but you have to start somewhere, where would you start? So Josina, I'll let you go first.
Oh, lucky me. I think kind of like building off of what I was trying to get at in kind of presenting the paper of this kind of design of the everyday. For me, it's like kind of starting exactly where you are. And I think that our bodies, so while Linda and I are talking about things being so complex, I also think our bodies are incredibly good at navigating complexity. We don't actually need to get paralyzed by giant system maps. We can use our senses, our intuition, the ways in which we navigate complexity every day to understand the opportunities for action and use our agency. So for me, it's kind of like situated in place in this moment, in the next moment, and it's really working to think about what the structures that are informing our lives and our own role in replicating them and in shaping them, and using every opportunity we have that feels safe to do so to actually drive at greater equity and drive at greater kind of regenerative systems in planetary health that Linda was getting at. So right where we are.
Right. Oh, wonderful. I couldn't agree more. I think starting by each one of us is a very important step if we want to make a change. So I fully agree with Josina on that. I think my second point would be the creation of an awareness that whatever affects someone else is going to come back and affect you. I think a lot of the issues that we are seeing, crises, a lot of the inequalities that we're seeing in the world, a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the world is that because people are not fully aware of how is that going to affect us. So creating an awareness that we are all responsible for everybody's issues and problems, and that this understanding, I'm hoping, will create more empathy, right? More empathy and desire to be involved, because yes, we do talk about these issues, but unless we really connect and see the implications on us individually, it will always be that, well, it's someone else's problem, it's not my problem. So for me, that definitely is creating that awareness.
Can I just build on that a little bit, right?
Sure, go ahead.
Or Linda, yeah, okay. So that just reminded me of an Audre Lorde quote of "There are no hierarchies of oppression," and I think where Audre Lorde is getting at this idea that we can't just say, okay, we're only going to work at oppression of women and negate issues of race or issues of homosexuality or other things. It's, as you're saying, where there is oppression, there's a potential to oppress anyone and it can come back. So I love that you capture that. And I think there's something really beautiful in realizing this lack of hierarchy around that issue. So love it.
All right, great. Let me add one comment, and then we've got a question on the screen that we'll move to in a moment there in the chat. But both of your comments have reminded me of I think, a fascinating idea that came from the aftermath of the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves. The concept of each one teach one that was used by former slaves to help teach each other to read and write and do other things, because so much of their prior experience had been so restricted. But the each one teach one is part of what Josina was talking about in terms of starting where you are. In other words, helping people is part of what I think is embedded in that. But it also connects to the interdependence idea with what Linda was talking about, because of reaching out and trying to teach each other things. So I really have always liked that each one teach one. It's an unfortunate concept in terms of where the idea comes from, but a lot of great ideas come from bad times. A lot of great ideas emerge from hard times. So to me, that's one of the ones that has stuck in my mind ever since, of each one teach one. All right, so we've got a question on our chat screen there. I'll read it for everyone's benefits, and then we'll let Josina and Linda respond. It says, thanks for 2 great presentations. Wondering if you have comments about how to turn conflict into understanding, and in parentheses, civil debates in the past were one mechanism.
I can start off. And this is something Ray and I have a bit of an ongoing debate about this, so I might be provoking Ray here, but I'm somebody who actually really embraces conflict and thinks that conflict is something that's really necessary for a healthy society. And Ray and I have a bit of debate around to what extent conflict is needed versus peace and these sorts of things. But for me, I'm really inspired. There's a book called A World of Many Worlds. It's one of my favorite books, and it talks about the idea of the uncommons. And it has kind of this connotation, the uncommons is saying, instead of working to kind of one common preferred future, what it is to hold the heterogeneity and be in constant negotiation with each other. And so I am very interested, as this kind of question is getting at, around how do we create service ecosystems that can actually safely hold conflict and respectfully hold conflict and be constantly adapting and in constant negotiation, and that we can hold the plurality of values and perspectives and be in ongoing relation with each other in that. So I think that kind of idea of civil debate, these kind of ongoing dialogues in our neighborhoods with people around us, and being confronted with different worldviews, I'm absolutely interested in how we bring that more into our everyday spaces. So I love that question, and really think about, like, yes, how can we build uncommons in our service ecosystems?
Right. No, this is a great answer, Josina. To build again on what you said, I think for me, conflict is when the 2 different opinions collide in a way that is not productive. So for me, I'm fine with the 2 different opinions, but what can we do for them to coexist together before it reaches the conflict? Because the conflict for me is more of a, it's too late. We haven't done what needs to be done if we have 2 different points of view before that conflict idea comes. And I probably would refer back to our human experience paper, where we again talk about collaboration and understanding and negotiations. So I think for me, it's again kind of linked to my prior answer. It's this idea of understanding that we need to see the other point of view so we can work with it. We can't just ignore it, because that it will lead to a conflict. So more of an understanding perspective. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the world is so, what's the word? Is so like it's either or, right? And that's what for me I think is the reason for a lot of the conflicts we're seeing in this world. Whereas I believe something and I'm strongly kind of thinking about it, and someone else believes, and we are not bridging. And I think there needs to be more work done on the bridging and kind of acceptance of others. And this work that I mentioned, the service thinking, we are proposing few ways to kind of foster that, including talking about service respect, service honesty, as like building blocks for avoiding conflict.
Says Josina, provoked me with the with her comment on conflict. I can't resist adding my own perspective to this. I mean, part of my objection to conflict is how it's practiced. And my biggest problem with it is too often leads from conflict of ideas to conflict of arms and people hitting, fighting, shooting, killing. And I think the root of that problem is that so much of human history is tied up in a logic of binary thinking, yes, right and wrong, good and evil. We can make a long list of binary thinking issues. And that's all of that thinking is zero-sum thinking. Of only two possibilities, and there have to be winners, there have to be losers. And anytime humans are in a winner-loser logic, I think we are not helping each other. I think we need to expand beyond the dualistic notion of right and wrong and open our minds to the possibility of more things. So I prefer more of a marketplace of ideas, and a marketplace needs more than two things to be a good marketplace. A marketplace needs a lot of good ideas so that the ideas are tested. And this is why I'm obsessed with science, because science tests ideas. And there's never an ego reason. You can't say, well, my ideas are better because I'm the most experienced. That doesn't work in science. Egos don't matter in science if you do science right. And it's possible to do science wrong, of course. But if we do science right, we can elevate the whole process by letting those ideas push and pull against each other and developing better solutions over time. But I'm not opposed to conflict as long as we can remember that if we can stay out of that binary logic, we're more likely to be okay. Do we have other questions there, Radil? I can't tell on my screen. My screen is, yeah, I guess maybe we don't. Well, we're already past the hour, so we should maybe stop. And I should thank our guests in the audience that are invisible to me, but I can tell by a number count that there are guests in the audience. But most importantly, I should thank Fordham for hosting this event, because Fordham University was the one that hosted us, and our Gabelli IT host is hiding behind a black screen as he does the technical work. But then, of course, thank Josina Vink and Linda Alcar for each presenting their work and getting us into a very interesting discussion over how can we actually do a better job with service ecosystems? Can we make service ecosystems healthy? And that's really a long-term issue. And that's really at the heart of where ServCollab expects we should be going. There's nothing short-term about ServCollab's thinking. We can't serve humans and we can't collaborate if we can't think long-term. So with that, I should stop. Radil, any last words on your side?
I would like to also thank everybody and the speakers and you, Ray, for organizing somehow this event, because it was your idea to have this topic today. And I would like to thank all the audience who attended the event.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting. I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you.
Thank you.